I'm going to read a section of Mikhail Bakunin's Gesammelte Werke, which is his collected works. This is from volume 3. You can find the PDF for this on Hathy Trust if you look for it. I couldn't find it anywhere else, even though since it deals with his personal relations with Karl Marx, that's the translation of this German title you see here next to me. It's fairly important. After Marx, Mikhail Bakunin was probably the most important socialist of the latter half of the 19th century, both as an activist and as a focal point for the non-authoritarian communists, aka the dissenting socialists, people who today would probably call themselves libertarian socialists. So he's an important guy, and he's going to describe his personal relations with Karl Marx. And this is my translation of the German, which is the only available version that I could find. He's writing this to the Italian socialists in order to clarify the ongoing split in the First International between these two groups that I've just described, the followers of Marx and then basically everybody else. But do not let this frighten you. Far from harming the development and expansion of the International, this conflict has contributed to its consolidation by better defining its principles and purpose. The conflict was unavoidable, as the one in Italian democracy separating you from Mazzini. You are convinced, are you not, that your break, the breaking of the vast majority of the Italian Democratic Party, did not harm the Mazzinist minority or sect of that party, but merely spurred this party on to more popular, freer, and necessarily socialist development, increasing their mental and physical strength, and thereby also increasing the number of their devoted and serious members. Likewise, we are convinced that the tremendous protest that is being raised today in the International against our own Mazzinists will be conducive to their greater and more sincere development, because even our Mazzinist group, which prevented our progress, did not have a Mazzinistic religious affiliation, because they are as atheistic as we are, but in terms of its authoritarian tendencies. It's the old story. Power corrupts even the smartest and most devious. Men like Marx, Engels, and some other men in the London General Council today are certainly, the matter, devoted and intelligent. They did the greatest service to the International, not as members of the General Council, since its role, as befits the free development of the International, is very limited by our general statutes, and its finances, which look considerable in the bookkeeping, are actually worth zero, and so far not even allowing him, the member of the General Council, to fulfill the duties imposed upon him by the statutes and congressional decisions. So that if the International developed and increased itself so impressively in a few years, it cannot be attributed to the necessarily null and void activity of the General Council, but the righteousness and worth of their principles, which are nothing but the most lofty, most faithful expression of the most intimate, deepest, and most passionate aspirations of the proletariat of all countries. Not as members of a legally and factually powerless General Council, did the men render their international services, but through their personal propaganda and activity. So what Bakunin is saying here is that if the men who sit on the General Council of the International got anything done, it was in spite of, not due to, the resources that were available to them from the organization, and that in general it made more trouble than it was worth. So if the International has become stronger and better, if more people are being attracted to it, then the individuals deserve all the credit, not the organization. So he's complimenting these people here. Marx is a man of great intelligence and a scholar in the widest and deepest sense of the word. He is a thorough economist, in comparison to whom Mazzini, whose economic knowledge is extremely superficial, can scarcely be called a pupil. Marx is also passionately devoted to the cause of the proletariat. Nobody has the right to doubt this, for he has served her for almost 30 years with undeniable endurance and loyalty. He dedicated his life to her. Mazzini, whose present powerlessness in the poison of his unjustified invectives, at the pleasure of invented fables and slander, seeks a sad consolation. And he asserts that Marx is animated only by hatred, not by love. Let's get this right. Deep, serious, passionate philanthropy is always accompanied by hate. One cannot love justice without detesting injustice. One cannot love freedom without abhorring authority. One cannot love humanity without detesting the spiritual and moral source of all despotism, the immoral fiction of the heavenly despot, the Lord God. One cannot love the oppressed without detesting the oppressors. So one cannot love the proletariat without hating the bourgeoisie. Marx loves the proletariat, so he abhors the bourgeoisie. One cannot serve a cause of passionate devotion for 30 years without loving it, and only the ugly presumption of slander dares deny Marx's love for the cause of the proletariat. To these great and indisputable merits follows this, that Marx was the initiator and chief inspirer of the founding of the International. These are the ministrations he has done. But now, every metal has its back, every light its shadow, and every man has his faults. Therefore, one should never entrust the power of the great people's community to a single man, even if it is a virtue-crowned genius, nor even the most intelligent and well-meaning minority, for, according to a law inherent in power itself, every power implies an abuse of power, and every government, even one appointed by universal suffrage, inevitably tends to despotism. So Marx too has his mistakes. They are the following. 1. First, he has the error of all professional scholars. He is doctrinaire. He absolutely believes in his theories, and from the height of these theories he despises all the world. As a learned and intelligent man, of course, he has his party, a corps of blind, devoted friends who will only swear by him, think only through him, have only his will. In short, these who idolize and worship him, and who corrupt him through this worship, a process which has already progressed quite a bit. He considers himself to be the Pope of socialism, or rather of communism, because he is, in his whole theory, an authoritarian communist, who, like Mazzini, although with other ideas and in a much more real and earthly manner than Mazzini, wants the liberation of the proletariat by the centralized power of the state. 2. To this self-worship in his absolute and absolutist theories follows, as a natural consequence, the hatred which Marx harbors not only against the bourgeoisie alone, but against all, even the revolutionary socialists, who contradict him and dare to follow a different direction from his theories. A direction different from his theories. Marx is something weird in a man so intelligent and so sincerely devoted, something that can only be explained by his education as a German scholar and writer, and especially by his nervous nature as a Jew. Marx is extremely vain to the point of filth and madness. Whoever has had the misfortune to injure his pathetic, ever-sensitive, and ever-irritated vanity, this man becomes an irreconcilable enemy of Marx. Then it becomes, by any means necessary, and in fact he uses the most shameful and unauthorized means to spoil this man in public opinion. He lies, invents, and tries to spread the dirtiest slander. In this respect, Mazzini was right in speaking of Marx's abominable character. But I beg you, dear friends, to note that Mazzini, in spite of his natural frame of mind, driven by his growing powerlessness, in his last polemics against his opponents, did almost the same thing. For Mazzini and Marx, despite how different they are in every other respect, and this difference is not always unfair to Marx, are driven by the same passion, the political ambition of one who is religious, the other scientific and doctrinaire, to govern, educate, and organize the masses according to their own ideas. Mazzini, whose high personal disinterestedness, spiritual purity, and elevation are known, feels the need to win his ideas, his party, his apostles. Marx, whose instincts are much less disinterested than Mazzini's, has a passionate wish, his ideas, the proletariat, and with his own person to witness the triumph. The ambition of the one is thus higher and above all more selflessly useful, that of the other more personal, but he leads both to the same course of action. Both lead to the same course of action. The evil lies in the search for power, in the love for domination, the thirst for authority, and Marx is profoundly infatuated with this evil. 3. His theory offers about this a great clue. As a leader and inspirer, if not the main organizer of the German Communist Party, generally he is very little an organizer and has more talent. He has more talent to divide by intrigue than to organize. He is an authoritarian communist and supporter of the liberation and reorganization of the proletariat by the state, consequently from the top to the bottom, through the intelligence and knowledge of an enlightened minority that naturally professes socialism and exercises a legitimate authority over it for the good of the ignorant and stupid masses. This political system is almost the same as the Mazzini's, but with a different program. This explains in part their great hatred of each other and their mutual inability to do justice to one another. Not only are their ideas and programs separating them, but they are also competitors for the same power. For both, one for his ideas and his apostles, the other for his ideas and himself, are not content with the hope of one day governing their own country. They dream of universal power, the universal state. Mazzini through Italy, first organized according to his ideas, then becomes queen of the world. Marx through Germany, the German race that is supposed to regenerate the world after him. Mazzini is very Italian, and Marx is a pan-Germanist to the bone marrow. The difference between the two is entirely in favor of Mazzini. He loves his faithful friends, his apostles, more so than he loves himself. He is lenient to a fault, and noble enough to forgive the injustices, abuses, and even the injustices of his friends that are committed against his own person. He forgives these all from the bottom of his heart. He never forgives, however, unfaithfulness to his religion, his divine ideas. Marx loves his own person much more than his friends and his apostles, and no friendship stands up to the slightest violation of his vanity. He would rather be forgiven for his infidelity against his philosophical and socialist system. He will regard it as proof of the stupidity, or at least the spiritual inferiority of his friend, and that will be fun for him. If he no longer sees in him a rival that could reach to his height, he may even prefer this person. But he will never forgive someone for his wrongdoing against himself, against Marx, that is. He must be worshipped. He must be made an idol to be loved by all. He must at least be feared and tolerated. He loves to surround himself with little people, with lackeys and flatterers. Nevertheless, there are some excellent men in his intimate environment. In general, however, one can say that there is very little fraternal openness in the intimate circle of Marx. On the other hand, there is a lot of ulterior motive and diplomacy. There is a kind of quiet struggle and a compromise between the self-love of individual persons, and where vanity is at play, there is no room left for brotherhood. Everyone is on his guard, and he fears to be sacrificed or destroyed. The whole circle of Marx is a kind of mutual conflict between the vanities that compose it. In it, Marx is the chief distributor of honors, but also always perfidious and treacherous, never free and always open to impulse of persecutions against persons whom he suspects, or who have had the misfortune not to pay their respects to him in the whole measure that he expects. Once he is ordered to persecution, he stops at no baseness and infamy. Himself a Jew, he has around him in London and France, but above all in Germany, a number of more or less clever, scheming, mobile, speculative Jews, as the Jews are everywhere, commercial or bank agents, literary figures, politicians, correspondents for newspapers of all shades. In a word, literary brokers, just as they are financial stockbrokers, one foot in the bank, the other in the socialist movement, and with their hind end on the German daily literature. They have all the newspapers, and you can imagine what kind of nauseating literature is the result. Well, this whole Jewish world, which is an exploitative sect, a leech people, a parasite made only for eating, narrow and intimate, not only across state lines, but across all the differences of political opinion. Today, this Jewish world is, for the most part, Marx on the one hand and the Rothschild on the other. I am certain that the Rothschilds on the one hand appreciate the services rendered by Marx, and that on the other hand, Marx feels instinctive attraction and respect for the Rothschilds. This may seem strange to you. What can be common between communism and the big bank? But Marx's communism wants powerful state centralization, and where there is such a thing, nowadays a central bank must inevitably exist. And where such a bank exists, the parasitic Jewish nation, speculating in the work of the people, must always find a way to exist. However that may be, the fact is that most of this Jewish world, especially in Germany, is available to Marx. Suffice it to call a person to persecute them. Suffice it to name a person to be persecuted, and a flood of injustices, filthy invectives, and ridiculous and infamous slanders break through in all socialist and non-socialist, Republican and monarchist newspapers. In Italy, where the feeling of mutual tenderness and human respect is so closely observed, at least in form, one cannot imagine the filthy tone and the really infamous nature of the daily polemics of the German press. These Jewish writers are particularly outstanding in the art of cowards, hateful and perfidious insinuations. They seldom openly complain, but they insinuate, quote, "It has been said," or "someone claims," or "it may not be true, but still, ... close quote, and then hurl the most cacophonous slander into your face. I know something from my own experience. Marx and I are old acquaintances. I met him for the first time in Paris in 1844. I was already an immigrant then. We were on good terms. At that time he was much more advanced than I, just as he is not yet more advanced, but incomparably more learned than I am today. At that time I understood nothing of economics. I had not freed myself from the metaphysical abstractions, and my socialism arose only out of a human instinct. Although younger than me, he was already an atheist, a learned materialist, and a thinking socialist. At that time, he was working out the first foundations of his present system. We met quite often, for I paid much heed to his knowledge and earnest and passionate devotion to the cause of the proletariat, although it was always mixed with personal vanity, and I eagerly sought conversations with him, always instructive and witty if one did not inspire petty hatred, which was unfortunately only too often the case, if he did not inspire petty hatred, he being Marx. There was never an open intimacy between us. Our temperaments were incompatible. He called me a sentimental idealist, and he was right. I called him a perfidious and treacherous vain man, and I was right too. In 1848 we disagreed, and I must say that reason was much more on his side than mine. He had founded a section of German communists in Paris and Brussels, and had founded, together with the French and some English communists, a first international association of communists from various countries, supported by his friend and close comrade Engels. There he edited, together with Engels, in the name of this company, an extremely remarkable writing, known under the title The Communist Manifesto. I myself, enraptured by the drunkenness of the revolutionary movement in Europe, had cared much more about the negative than the positive side of this revolution, much more about the overthrow of the existing than about the construction and organization of what should follow. But there was a point where I was right against him. As a slave, I wanted the liberation of the Slavic race from the yoke of the Germans by this revolution, that is, by the destruction of the empires of Russia, Austria, Prussia, and Turkey, and by the reorganization of the peoples from the bottom up through their own freedom on the basis of complete economic and social equality, and not by the power of an authority, not by how revolutionary someone calls themselves and or how intelligent they actually are. Even then, the difference in the systems that separate us today in a way that is now quite deliberate on my part has become more and more pronounced. My ideas and aspirations must have displeased Marx, at first because it was not his own, and then because they ran contrary to the convictions of the authoritarian communists. Finally, because he is a German patriot at that time as well as today, still will not allow the right of the Slav to free himself from the German yoke. Admitted today as well as at that time, he thinks that the Germans are called to civilize the Slavs, that is, to Germanize them, in good faith, or by force. In order to punish me for my daring to carry out the realization of an idea that was different and even contrary to his own conception, Marx avenged himself in this way. He was editor of the Neue Rheinische Zeitung, published in Cologne. In a number of these newspapers I had read a correspondent from Paris saying that Mrs. George Sand, with whom I was once acquainted, had told someone that one must beware of Bakunin, for it is quite possible that he might be something like a Russian agent. This charge hit me on the head like a roof tile. Just as I was in full revolutionary organization, it completely paralyzed my activities for several weeks. All my German and Slavic friends kept away from me. I was at that time the first Russian active in the revolutions of 1848, and I do not need to tell you what feelings of habitual, traditional mistrust first seize every Western mind when it hears of a Russian revolutionary. So I wrote to Mrs. Sand. She hastened to answer me by sending me a copy of the letter she addressed to the editors of the Neue Rheinische Zeitung, for which she gave a formal and very severe denial. I was in Wroclaw, and sent a friend, a Pole, to Cologne to demand a formal and complete withdrawal. Marx made the withdrawal, blamed the Paris correspondent, and declared that the newspaper had received this correspondence in his absence. He knew me too well to ever have blah, 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 etc., a lot of compliments and assurances of friendship and respect. This ended the matter. I met him a few months later in Berlin. Common friends forced us to hug each other, and then, during a half-joking, half-serious conversation, Marx told me, quote, "Do you know that I am now at the head of such a well-disciplined and secret communist society that if I were to tell a member of it, 'Go and kill Bakunin,' he would kill you?" I replied that if his secret society had nothing else to do but kill people who displeased him, they could only be a company of servants or a bunch of ridiculous, boastful hens. After this conversation in August 1848, we did not meet again until 1864. I was caught in 1849, processed in Saxony and condemned to death. I was extradited to Austria in 1850 because the King of Saxony refused to have anyone executed, although my two comrades, Rochel and Heubner, and I, all three of us, had refused to ask for mercy. Processed in Austria and condemned to death, I was extradited to Russia in 1851, as Austria had promised the King of Saxony not to let me be executed. What promise Russia had to give to the same King of Saxony anew. Okay, so Russia also had to promise not to execute him. A passionate botanist, you see, the King of Saxony was, and no malicious person. In Russia, I spent 6 years in the fortress, and was banished to Siberia in 1857, from where I fled in 1861 to Japan, over the Great Ocean, to San Francisco, the Isthmus of Panama, and New York. At the end of December 1861, I arrived in London. I met there my compatriots Herzen and Ogareff, and became known by them with Mazzini. Then Herzen, Ogareff, and Mazzini told me this: while I did not enjoy myself at all in the German and Russian fortresses and in Siberia, Marx and his friends had circulated rumors against me, hawked them and sold them, published in English and in German newspapers. They said that it was not true that I was imprisoned in a fortress, that on the contrary, the Emperor Nicholas had welcomed me with open arms, as Nicholas I, offering me all the comforts and pleasures of life, that I should be well with gallant women and champagne, and etc., etc. This was infamous, but it was stupid too. Incidentally, they were severely punished, and I owe Mazzini and his noble friend, Poland's Vorsel, head of Polish democracy, eternal gratitude for their vigorous movement on my behalf when I was absent and could not defend myself. Arriving in London, an English paper edited by a certain Urquhart, a Turkophile and a half-fool, published that the Russian government evidently had sent me to work as a spy. I responded in a newspaper, calling for the anonymous slanderer to name himself, and I promised to answer, not with the pen in hand, but with the hand without pen. He let that be said, and I was left alone. I stayed in London in 1862, without, of course, seeking to meet Marx. At the beginning of 1863, I traveled to Sweden to work for a Russian revolution to help the Polish Revolution. I even belonged to an expedition across the sea that would take us to the coasts of Poland. Betrayed by the captain of the narrow steamship that was to take us there, it was with great difficulty that we escaped a pursuing Russian warship. At the end of 1863, I returned to London from Sweden and traveled from there through Belgium, France, and Switzerland, finally to Italy, with letters of recommendation from Mazzini and my former friend Aurelio Safi to all their friends. I was in Caprera and had the opportunity to make the acquaintance of General Garibaldi. I spent the winter and part of the summer of 1864 in Tuscany and returned to Sweden in August 1864 through the same countries. In October, I came back to London. At that time, I received from Marx a small letter, which I still hold, in which he asked me if I would like to receive him the next day. I answered him in the affirmative, and he came. We had an argument then. He swore that he had never said or done anything against me, that on the contrary he had always kept with me sincere friendship and respect. I knew he was telling me lies, but I did not hold any grudges. Incidentally, the renewal of the acquaintance interested me greatly in a different relationship, in a different way. I knew that he had played a powerful role in founding the International. I had read the manifesto he had written in the name of the Provisional General Council, a manifesto that was serious, significant, and profound, like everything written by him, if he does not engage in personal polemics. In short, we separated ourselves externally as very good friends, but I did not return his visit. I returned to Florence, where I spent the whole winter, and from where I went to Naples in the spring of 1865 and stayed there until September 1867, the time of the first Congress of the Peace and Freedom League in Geneva. I exchanged some letters with Marx. Then we lost contact. It was precisely at the Geneva Peace Congress that the old communist Philip Becker, who was also one of the founders of the International and a close friend of Marx, presented me in the German way, which does nothing better than to say the worst of others, if it can happen without compromising. Handed to me from Marx himself, quote, the first and so far only volume of an extremely important, scholarly, and profound, though very abstract work, Das Kapital. So this is the end of the letter. Again, so this was written to the Italian socialists to explain what's going on with Mazzini and Marx and the split in the International that's going on in London. What happened afterwards is that they returned to being inveterate enemies, I think, until the end of Bakunin's life. He would die in 1876, I believe. So, according to this letter, Bakunin gets the first ever copy of Das Kapital Volume 1. This is Marx, reaching down from heaven, from the heavens of the communist, authoritarian communist group and from the International to try to mend the fracture with Bakunin by saying, we've had our differences, but I'm going to give you the first version of this major work. And then Bakunin never wrote a thank you note to Marx. So that was the biggest insult that could possibly happen. I hope you enjoyed this. Thank you for your time.